So it's been a while since we've checked in on the conflict in Ukraine. I thought we'd have a look at some of the developments. President Zelensky has repeatedly ruled out the possibility of signing a peace treaty, which would possibly annex the Donbass regions to Russian influence and bring the war to, I suppose, for the Ukrainian people, an unsatisfactory close, but of a nuclear disaster. That might be some sort of prudent choice. There have been a number of developments in the escalation of the conflict. So the Nord Stream pipeline has been mysteriously blown up, as has a bridge connecting Russia and Crimea, and then now roving gangs of vigilantes are hunting down Ukrainians accused of treason, which I'm sure we'd be concerned about if it were any other country, but which is allowing it to go on. So the Russians are actually spinning this to their advantage, to a lot of their allies. They're making people think, oh, well, the West are having an unending proxy war on us, and so you need to give us money and resources. But they're not only effectively blaming the West for the mysterious coincidences that we'll be looking at in a moment, they're also mocking our Western decadence and the media and all of the ideological capture conducted in institutions while they're at it. So I thought we'd see things from the Russians' perspective and see what the other half of the world seem to think of us.
Sure.
So if we can just play the first one, we can see the bridge between Russia and Crimea was blown up. I'm not sure where the actual footage came from. I assume a security camera. But, yeah.
That was quite a big explosion, wasn't it?
Yeah, just a tad. I don't think it was... it doesn't look accidental.
No.
It looks...
It's certainly not a car explosion, is it? That's definitely...
Yeah. That
military
like
equipment.
Some kind of bomb. Yeah, if you'd not been able to see the fact there wasn't a missile falling on it, you would suspect it. The blast actually killed 3 innocent people. So I think it's fair to call this an indiscriminate act of terrorism against, yes, enemy infrastructure, but also people were just driving over it. They weren't combatants, and so 3 people lost their lives. Not good, no matter where you stand in the war. I'm not a fan of either of them. Shock. But if you see this tweet here, this is one of Zelensky's prime policy advisors, and he says, Crimea, the bridge, the beginning, everything illegal must be destroyed, everything stolen must be returned to Ukraine, everything occupied by Russia must be expelled. So he's obviously, when he's talking about the illegal bridge, he's talking about the fact that Russia had occupied Crimea since 2014. There were multiple peace agreements that didn't really do much to settle tensions, hence the reason that Russia are currently occupying Ukraine. But one of the figureheads of the Ukrainian war is celebrating 3 civilians who have got no say over whether or not the war is waged being killed. It's not like Alexander Dugin's daughter being blown up when she had some political influence. You might be able to negotiate some kind of excuse there of targeting a prominent participant in the war. I'm not going to say it, but you might be able to spin the story. This one, no. Come on. You were targeting infrastructure and there was someone on the bridge that shouldn't have been done. Goes to the next one as well. Literal traitors are cheering it on. Alexander Vindman. Do you know who this gentleman is?
I don't actually know.
He is the fella who overheard Trump's phone call to Zelensky asking for the quid pro quo, which was actually obviously Biden's quid pro quo. Wow, try saying that when you're drunk. Saying, son of a bitch, if you don't fire it, then you're not going to get the $1 billion in aid for Ukraine. He is the one that dobbed in President Trump and sat on the phony impeachment scandal. And that CNN and Fox News ran parallel headlines where it said, Vindman says no quid pro quo, and CNN says, Vindman says absolutely quid pro quo. So, again, we're seeing parallel realities emerge, but you get the uniparty, the military-industrial complex, and officials from Ukraine cheering this thing on. It's like, okay, well, do we think to spare a thought for the people died who weren't bombing Ukraine?
It is kind of insensitive, isn't it? Well, not kind of, it is insensitive that, you know, a strike kills innocent people. It's like, I've been dreaming of this moment.
Yeah.
Well, you've been dreaming of civilian casualties. So it's a bit of a weird dream to have, Mr. Vindman.
Yeah, when you put it like that, yeah. If we look at another mysterious explosion, then we've got Nord Stream. This is Sky News reporting on it at the end of September. The Kremlin and others say they can't rule out sabotage after, quote, unprecedented damage was caused to both Nord Streams 1 and 2, a day before a new pipeline from Norwegian gas fields carrying to Europe opened. 2 pipelines running underwater from Russia to Germany were damaged in a total of 3 places on Monday. Nord Stream AG, the owner, described the breakages as unprecedented. The pipes were not pumping gas to Europe at the time the leaks were found amid the dispute over Russia's war in Ukraine. They paused it to hike the gas prices up, obviously, leveraging it over Europe while they supply Ukraine with arms and aid. Mateusz Morawiecki, I hope that's correct, Polish Prime Minister, it's probably not, said it was an act of sabotage while his Danish counterpart Mette Frederiksen, said she called the leaks deliberate actions, and the Danish Energy Authority said that any event like this was extremely rare. So they're blaming the Russians, whereas the Kremlin said it couldn't rule out sabotage as a cause of damage, with spokesman Dmitry Peskov describing developments as very concerning news. A European security source says there are some indications that there is deliberate damage. You have to ask who would profit.
But the Russians can just twist the valve and cut it off. So it seems strange. Obviously, it could be like a false flag trying to smear the West. But there are certain countries, I don't know whether YouTube can allow me to say specific countries, but there are certain Nordic countries and certain North American countries that could stand to benefit from this, say countries that produce fossil fuels.
Or countries that would like to make it seem as if there is no alternative other than to put all of their population on rationable renewables. And there's also, in terms of sabotaging global gas supplies, there's also the cyber warfare angle of it. I know the Israeli Defense Force developed a cyber virus that got into the systems of Iran, populated all of their devices, and it wasn't until it got to a certain component in their
nuclear reactors,
all the valves blew it up. It's like, right, okay, could this be also something that's purely speculative, of course, could this be also something of the same lines? But we have reason to suspect it because of something Joe Biden said. If we can play the words of the president himself.
Let me answer the first question first. If Russia invades, that means tanks or troops crossing the border of Ukraine again. Then there will be no longer a Nord Stream 2. We will bring an end to it.
How will you do that exactly? Since the project and control of the project is within Germany's control.
We will. I promise you, we'll be able to do it.
Okay, well that's just a threat. But, again, were it any other president and were it not nearing nuclear war, I'd almost be impressed. It's like when President Trump killed the Iranian terrorist sponsor general and just tweeted out the American flag, bombed him on his own tarmac. But I wonder why Putin suspects the Americans blowing it up. Whether or not he's lying is, of course, a completely different thing. So then we have Putin going out there and just stating in a Reuters piece, Anglo-Saxon powers blew up Nord Stream pipelines. It's very interesting framing.
That's an interestingly vague thing.
Well, it's actually very specific. Because
well,
we spoke in a gold tier subscriber Zoom call, which you can join if you subscribe to the website for £30 a month. The framing is actually pretty astute because one of our subscribers who's familiar with Russian culture said they dichotomize the sort of Anglosphere as ethnically separate to mainland Europe, whereas obviously we see everything as very culturally separate. And yeah, of course you can say different Germanic tribes and things like that, they're ethnically separate. But we have a very distinct culture from the sort of totalizing mentality of the Germans who drang nach absolutum, drive towards the absolute, whereas we are a lot more parochial and we like our hobbies and things like that. And so he is blaming the broad, disparate Anglo-Saxon culture that has been exported from Britain. So you could just call it liberalism, I suppose, that's gone to the likes of Australia, America, the Commonwealth countries. So Putin is actually being very targeted in saying, we believe this is Britain's influence in Ukraine, Boris Johnson, and Biden's influence in America, possibly the Americans sabotaging Nord Stream. He's being very specific. And they aren't wrong about the idea that liberalism has been exported and that it has been an eroding force on the world. That's not to say that Putin is a fantastic person either. Obviously, he kills journalists. We're not a fan. But it is true that pathologically permissive progressivism germinated in the liberalism of Locke and Rousseau. Carl's talked about his 5 false assumptions. Will Noland, actually, if you go over and subscribe to the website, you'll be able to read this little article here, talked about it in his Universal Acid of Liberalism article, and he basically argues that the parameters of liberalism have been expanded from preventing incursions upon your liberty, your individual bodily autonomy by government, to liberating you from any expectations, not only from your peers and the family you're born into and inextricably inherit, but also biology, nature, anything that constrains your will and ambition. And I suppose if there's any nation that's ripe for an antibody reaction to sort of revolutionary abolition of reasonable constraints that seems similar to communism, it might be the Russians, even though Putin is acting very similarly imperialistically to the Soviet Union. He definitely can at least articulate the idea that the West is decadent and waging a revolution against family, nation, etc. He can coach it in the language. And we can actually see that quite astutely in the Russian propaganda that we have here. So I'll just narrate this because the subtitles. This Russian family says, "How long have I waited to do this?" And someone turns around their seat and says, "You're flying to America." And he says, "Yes, we're moving here." And the woman says, "Yes, America's the freest country in the world, the land of opportunity." The wife asks, "Are you with your husband?" And the American woman goes, "Yes, we're here soon. And here is my husband." And a rather large, stunning and brave man sits down, farts, and goes, "Hello." And so the Russian wife then looks at her Russian husband and is confused. So then it cuts to them eating steak on the plane, and the air hostess says, "Sorry, mister, passengers behind you are vegetarians. They are discomforted because you're eating meat in front of them." And he's saying we don't force them to eat it, but she's saying, "Sorry, but in the US it's customary to adhere to the principles of democracy. Let me take it from you." And then she just takes his food away because the vegetarians behind him are offended. And the Russians are again left incredibly confused. Then the Russian man says to a black man, there's a line when they're trying to leave the plane, and he says, "I tell you, get in line to the toilet." Well, they're not trying to leave the plane, it's to the toilet. And the air hostess goes, "I'm sorry, is there a problem?" And the Russian guy goes, "Yeah, he's jumping ahead." And she says, "So what? You don't want him to skip it? Don't want to miss skipping, do you?" And he goes, Sure, you need to let him skip in front of you." And another passenger cuts in. He goes, "We will wait. His people have endured the oppression of white people for many years. We all owe African Americans a debt." And then all of the other passengers say, "Forgive us, sir," and begin kneeling like they're Nancy Pelosi wearing kente cloth.
It's not exactly subtle, is it?
No, but it is kind of accurate.
I mean, it's obviously amped up for comedy's sake, but
Yes.
I know what they're getting at here.
Yeah. It's we must, and so the black gentleman swaggers off to the toilet. Then it cuts again. "Can you move to the front of the plane?" the air hostess asks. And he says, "Only me?" And she goes, No, your entire family." And he goes, "Why?" And she says, "There's a couple behind you, they're child-free." They don't look very happy. The fact that your son gets into their field of vision makes them very uncomfortable. So then they strap themselves with life vests and prepare to jump out of the plane.
I like how they're not strapping themselves with parachutes. It
must be really low flying. Well, I just like the idea that they decided to pull up their phone and just look at the Russian military adverts versus the American military adverts and say, "I was a girl in California with 2 mums. Nope, not going over there. Definitely not." The thing is, though, the fact that they can nail America and the rest of the West on this is kind of embarrassing because it's not inaccurate. Again, we're not holding water for the Russians here. I wouldn't want to live there either, but we have become ridiculously decadent. We're caving to the unreasonable demands of a baying mob who would like to depict themselves as victims, just have something meaningful going on.
I think the real world implications of this is how can the Anglosphere have power projection on the international stage if we're a laughing stock?
Yeah.
You know, they can only fear our bullets for so long before they start laughing at us because they have rainbow flags painted on them.
Yeah, and literally there was the joke that got realised a little while ago of the pride bomb with the BLM fist. It's like, congratulations, the military-industrial complex are now on ESGs and sponsoring pride events. Like, why is Raytheon sponsoring Drag Queen Story Hour? Why does Drag Queen Story Hour exist? Why is Raytheon at the Conservative Party conference with a booth, by any chance, alongside Stonewall? Mysteries never cease. So this has all given Russia some actual ammunition to bolster support from within their own population and their allies. And bear in mind, they're still sending out conscripts. They're not even properly sending in the Russian army yet. I mean, their equipment's not all that, and it's getting spotted by satellites, but they've still got plenty of reserves, so the old Russian tactic of just throwing bodies at the problem could potentially win out, and that's not a great prospect, is it? So Ukraine are also giving Russia more ammunition because they've been hunting down, taking brutal revenge on so-called collaborators who've betrayed their neighbours and the country to the Russians. So I'm just going to read this little article here because I think if it were any other country, specifically one that we're paying for the war effort to aid, forced to pay for through our taxes, we'd raise concerns over human rights violations. Bear in mind, Zelensky also axed a bunch of rival parties during wartime, so he's become a de facto one-party state and controls the press. Now we're seeing, according to the Daily Mail, the horror stories emerging in liberated towns such as Bakalia, a railway hub of 30,000 people, have become hideously familiar in recent months, of Russian atrocities, mass graves, torture and war crimes. If all those are true, that's obviously evil. Yet the uncomfortable truth is that some Ukrainians have been assisting Vladimir Putin's war crimes and theft of their land. Kyiv has already opened investigations into 1,309 suspected traitors and launched 450 prosecutions of collaborators accused of betraying their own nation and neighbours. Others are being tracked down and slaughtered by resistance fighters. A list passed onto this newspaper by a Kyiv government source identifies 29 such retribution killings, with 13 more assassination attempts that left some targets wounded. A hunt has been declared on collaborators and their life is not protected by law, said Anton Gerashenko, an advisor to the Interior Ministry. Our intelligence services are eliminating them, shooting them like pigs. So without a trial, I will say, now, I'm not even necessarily against executing wartime criminals, but I would like some transparency on exactly what these people did. These loathed losers, a term used by one Ukrainian government minister, saw Russia's occupation as a chance to grab power, money and status. There have been at least 29 suspicious deaths starting in March, with the mayor of a town in Luhansk who suffered a gunshot wound to the heart after being abducted from his home, according to his wife. That does sound like the secret police. That's just disconcerting. Again, I'd like some transparency, please. One former Ukrainian MP, previously accused of child abuse, died in a missile strike. He had fled to Russia in 2014 after Putin's initial incursions before returning to Kherson and proclaiming joy at being back in his, quote, motherland. So there are some people in here who seem like you should not cry a river, but I would like more information on these not indiscriminate, but opaque killings of people. That would be fantastic.
It is unfortunately common in a lot of conflicts to have things like this. It doesn't necessarily mean it's right, but it's also to be somewhat expected as well, unfortunately.
Yeah. And it's also a reason why I don't want to pay for it. I'm sorry. I don't. And neither do a lot of Britons, actually, because we went to the Conservative Party conference, and in the Tony Blair Institute, God knows why they let them in, pretty much everyone from northern grandmas to, Bradford accented Asian guys, broad spectrum people just said, yeah, don't want to pay for it, it's too cold. No thanks, not a vote winner. It's like, okay, well, things like this are not only galvanising support from the Russian side of the Isle of Bricks, but you're putting the West off from seeing you as a bastion of democracy, as they've been beaten over the head with every time someone changes their profile photo to a Ukrainian flag. So, just finishing with this, the progress of Ukrainian forces comes a day after Mr. Zelensky ruled out peace talks with Putin and vowed to oust the occupier from all of our land, as he boasted his troops hammering Russian soldiers. He said negotiations with his counterpart are now impossible following his decision to rubber stamp the annexation of 4 regions of the country. Right. Impossible to negotiate. What does that leave us with? An escalation of tension. And so now, without the prospect of peace being on the table, a lot of neighbouring countries and the Ukrainians themselves are growing increasingly nervous. If we go to this Newsweek article, NATO's Poland is open to hosting US nuclear weapons. Right. So another Cuban Missile Crisis. That won't lead us towards nuclear war at all. Poland's Deputy Prime Minister, God, I hate these names, Jarosław Kaczynski, said he is open to the idea of the US deploying tactical nuclear weapons in his country, and called for Washington to send tens of thousands more American troops to Europe to check the Russian threat. The eastern flank must be much better protected than in the future than before, Kaczynski told German's Welt am Sonntag newspaper, asking Americans to station 50,000 more troops, a 50% increase, with most of the total in the Baltics and Poland, which are NATO allies. Asked if he thought the US should deploy tactical nuclear weapons to Eastern Europe, Kaczynski said he had discussed the idea with American senators while still in opposition with his Law and Justice party. Now,
it's certainly not a de-escalating move, is it?
No.
It's not a move to wind down the conflict, and you can certainly imagine, say, if the Russians moved nuclear weapons to Mexico, the Americans would be pretty nervous.
Yeah, exactly. When the Soviets just employed nuclear missiles off the coast of Florida in Cuba, congratulations. They had a massive standoff. That
is probably the closest we've come to nuclear war, or at least one of the closest.
Yeah, and now both Poland and American senators, not named here, are manufacturing a same sort of circumstance. And the Ukrainians themselves are very keen on it. Again, we went to, myself and Rory, the Conservative Friends of Ukraine reception at Conservative Party conference. And not only did Ben Wallace not bother showing up, the Ukrainian...
Who is the defence minister.
Yes, you're right, context. The Ukrainian ambassadors both said they want NATO membership, as has Zelensky. And it's like, okay, if a NATO member is invaded, we have to go to war with them as part of the Defence Pact. What if someone joins NATO currently while being invaded? That's a de facto hot war with all of NATO versus all of BRICS and the Belt and Road Initiative. That is a larger scale world war than the Second World War. That is all of South America, all of Africa under Chinese control. That is most of Asia. Nightmarish scenario. And they seem to know this escalation towards a nuclear war. Because if we go to the next one, the New York Times has reported that the European Union has given iodine tablets to Ukraine. Now, if you're not familiar, potassium iodine is also known by the chemical symbol Ki, and it's used to saturate the thyroid gland with iodine so that inhaled or ingested radioactive iodine is not retained. So the nuclear fallout will not poison you. They are pre-arming people medically against a nuclear strike.
I think I might want to get some iodine tablets.
Yeah, as a prepper, it's a good idea. The European Union is set to donate 5.5 million potassium iodine tablets to Ukraine, the bloc's executive arm said on Tuesday, amid growing concerns about the shelling around, this is so difficult, Zaporizhzhia, the nuclear power plant, basically, that's under threat.
That's not Zaporozhye, is it?
Bless you. The Ukrainian government asked for iodine pills on Friday as a preventative safety measure for residents in the proximity of the nuclear facilities, the European Commission said. So, clearly, if our elites think it's very likely, and they're also spending multi-million dollars on rejuvenating their nuclear bunkers, the US government just gave a contract to one as well, so clearly they're thinking something is coming. I'm going to get slightly worried when you're putting nukes on the border of Russia. So this has just led to Western apathy. The optics aren't looking very good. So if we go to the next one, there's a piece from the Times. Only 45% of young Britain support the UK's role in Ukraine. As I said, the electoral sort of focus groups at the Conservative Party conference didn't bode well results for that. Less than half of people are now supporting. Young people are now supporting it. The Ipsos online poll of 1,095 people found there was strong backing for the UK's contribution overall, but the opinion was softer among the younger generation. Yeah, because we're going to have to pay for it for many years. And yet, if we go over to the Associated Press piece, the UK's new leader, Liz Truss, for all who have to live here underneath her, slams Putin and hails the Queen in her debut UN speech. So, the United Nations, British Prime Minister Liz Truss on Wednesday accused Russian President Vladimir Putin of making saber-rattling threats to cover his failed invasion of Ukraine. In her debut speech to the UN General Assembly, Truss called the war in Ukraine a battle for, quote, our values and the security of the whole world, and extolled the late Queen Elizabeth II as a symbol of everything the UN stands for. I think Elizabeth II should be offended by being compared to the White Hats. Opponents say tax cuts reward the rich more than the poor. And this is talking about how she's going to fund the already 2.3 billion that we've committed to Ukraine and more. But they're saying, but it will do little to ease the cost of living crisis, fueled largely by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, this piece was also reposted, and we don't have it here, but it was also been reposted in CNBC, word for word. What is with the editorializing? They're just covering for the fact that the decades of terrible energy policy, terrible national security policy, and now pissing away money on the uniparty military-industrial complex apparatus is immiserating us, and they're trying to hide it by saying, oh, it's all Putin's fault. And again, what you're going to do is, you're not only going to get galvanized support in Russia, you're going to annoy people in the West and just make them give up with any sympathy. I already don't want to pay for it. Now I just kind of don't care.
It wasn't as if supply lines were disrupted whatsoever through the 2 years of an overreaction to a certain thing.
Yeah.
I can't explicitly state.
Don't worry, YouTube. We're not denying the existence of a certain respiratory condition. Also, it's not like Joe Biden had any impact on global gas supply chains when he shut down the Keystone XL pipeline, cancelled drilling and fracking leases on federal land, when Donald Trump had made the entire country of America, for the first time since Nixon had promised it, energy independent and reduced emissions. It's almost like they're sabotaging bad policy. So I'd just like everyone to take a listen to Elon Musk, which at the time of recording has apparently spoken to Putin and is adjusting the amount of satellites that are targeting Russian cargo envoys, even though he was recently called by, I believe it's a Google CEO, the true hero of this war by providing the Starlink internet. So it may be that he's rescinding his unilateral support for Ukraine to try and push them towards a peace deal. Risky gamble. But Elon Musk actually put out a Twitter poll saying, Russia and Ukraine peace. Redo elections of annexed regions under the UN supervision. Not that the UN are particularly great, but it seems to be all you've got to bring them to the table. Russia leaves if that is the will of the people. Crimea, formerly part of Russia, as it has been since 1783 until Khrushchev's mistake. Water supply to Crimea assured, Ukraine remains neutral, and he put up a yes or no poll. And this was trending roughly even until a sudden spike, and that skewed it towards nearly 60% no and 40% yes. And a lot of people suggested that this is a lot of bots influencing the actual results, particularly because Elon Musk, not only because he's now buying Twitter, is one of the most popular Twitter accounts on the platform even before he entered the deal. So the idea that this could sway public opinion if you flooded it with bots is pretty prominent. And this is why the likes of Tim Pool and Luke Rudkowski have suggested that this was one of the main catalysts for Elon Musk jumping back into the buying position, is that he's thinking, oh God, bots are literally pushing us towards nuclear war.
When there's 2.7 million people responding, it's almost certain that there are. It's just whether they significantly altered the result or not is the question.
Yes. If we go on to the next one, after this he said, let's try this instead then. The will of the people who live in the Donbass and Crimea region should decide whether they're part of Russia or Ukraine. And there was a unanimous vote of yes, but with pretty much the same proportions. It was, 10 more. If you just scroll down slightly, John, the same fella that celebrated the collapse of the bridge and the death of 3 legitimate people, who works for Zelensky, and his name is in Cyrillic, so I can't really read that. Are you trying to legitimize pseudo-referendums that took place at gunpoint under the conditions of persecution, mass executions, and torture? Bad path. And Elon Musk says, no, I'm suggesting voting under UN or pick your most trusted entity or country supervision. And that's not impossible, because they recently signed the ability to lift naval blockades to allow grain shipments through in Turkey. So there is a possibility of meeting at a peace summit. It's just Zelensky is routinely ruling it out. And so by doing that, by the West being involved in clandestine operations, allegedly, by being ridiculously weakened by Wokery, then we are unable to look strong on the world stage. We have allowed Putin carte blanche to march his tanks over the border. And if there is no ability for peaceful resolution here, as Elon Musk is urging, then are we just going to be pushed towards nuclear war? I don't want leftist cringe to mean so that we can't stop the mushroom clouds appearing in the sky. I'd quite like to live. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this segment from the podcast Lotus Eaters. If you enjoyed that, you can subscribe to our website to access our premium content, including this recent epochs that Carl and Bo have done, talking about William the Conqueror. This is part 3 of a multi-part series they have been doing. If you'd like to find even more, you can follow us on Getter at lotuseaters_com. Thank you and goodbye.